Today's guest says, although I'm just an ordinary guy, I'm able to live an extraordinary life. Is the extraordinary hiding in plain sight? And can you and I find happiness in everyday ordinary things? Let's find out. Episode 267 features Daniel Stuart Olmes, husband, father, entrepreneur, author.
She was paralyzed from the waist down. I was close enough where I could see the look on her face. And that it was an unwanted struggle. It was years of frustration that came out in that couple minutes that I watched her. And I immediately thought about the countless other things in her life that are just so much more difficult than mine. And the first thought that came to mind is, you'll never hear me say that I had a hard day.
Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. I'm Andy Wong, host of the Inspired Money podcast, where we share positive perspectives on money so we can make a bigger impact in our communities and in the world. This episode is brought to you by my company, Runnymede Capital Management. I'm a financial advisor and owner at Runnymede, where individuals, families, and business owners hire us to invest their money through full market cycles. That includes taxable accounts, IRAs, Roth IRAs, and trust accounts. We also help small business owners to optimize 401k retirement plans for their employees. There are always uncertainties in the economy and stock market, so the key is to have a plan. If you have questions about your money or finances, contact me. Our goal is to be defensive ahead of financial hurricanes, and we officially called a hurricane alert on our April 2022 client conference call. If you want insights into our market outlook, subscribe to my email that goes out every 2 weeks by going to inspiredmoney.fm/newsletter. We've got Danny on the show. He's a family man, entrepreneur, runner, avid reader, Little League baseball coach. He's the president and chief operating officer of a mid-sized government contractor. On the surface, he's an ordinary guy. He even wrote a book entitled Memoirs of an Ordinary Guy: The Everyday Life Experiences That Changed My Life. Talk to Danny, and he'll redefine what it means to be an extraordinary person. It doesn't mean rich or famous. It doesn't mean better. To Danny, extraordinary means being grateful, honest, happy, loving, fearless, and faithful. It means human, simple, ordinary. And the journey to great doesn't end. It's a constant pursuit. In this episode, you'll learn about the power of journaling to track and reflect upon moments in your life, why greatness should be a reflex, and stay tuned to the end to hear about taking the harder road and taking major risks in your life. Now let's get inspired with Danny Olmes. Danny, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Andy, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity and the opportunity to be here with you and to discuss a little bit about the book and a little about my story. I appreciate it.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
I'd have to say that my earliest memory of money was actually, probably not having a whole lot of it. I grew up in a beautiful home. I grew up in a wonderful area outside of Washington, D.C., very affluent area. But my mother growing up worked at a secondhand store, a thrift shop, selling, clothes to the community. And her job in particular was to give free clothing to people that were on assistance from the county. And, I think she made maybe $10 an hour or something. My dad was a civil servant for the U.S. government. But I remember them, talking about the finances in front of me as a kid. And, even though I had everything a little boy would need, it always seemed like there wasn't, a whole lot of money, extra money every week. And so I became very aware of what things cost at a young age. And also not to maybe pester my parents for every last thing that I wanted, because, while I seemingly lived in abundance, it maybe wasn't that when you pull the covers over, right? So.
It sounded like your mom found some good deals on clothing for you, And then maybe you paid really close attention to what other people were wearing.
Well, I did, and I paid a lot of attention to what I was wearing because, I wrote in my book about this. All of my clothes came from a secondhand store. They were used. They were beautiful. I mean, it's amazing what people throw away, right? But my mother got them for pennies on the dollar, or maybe even free because she worked there. And I was very insecure about that growing up. When somebody would ask me, where I got a sweater, where I got that new pair of jeans, a trip to the big name department store wasn't really necessarily something that was, a common thing in my household. So when people would bring stuff like that up, I would quickly change the subject, or I'd actually lie, because of, that somehow was a reflection of my self-worth, right?
Well, it seems like in your 40s, you've come into your own. Like you've gotten much more comfortable in your own skin and maybe rid yourself of some of those insecurities. In your book, you wrote, I'm an ordinary guy. I'm able to live an extraordinary life. And you say that extraordinary is there for all of us. It doesn't mean rich or famous. Can you reframe for us what it means to be extraordinary?
Sure. For a period of time, I read a lot of books in sort of the self-help or motivational genre, and all of them describe individuals or experiences that are extraordinary, whether it's, making a lot of money, popularity, influence, fame, breaking records, or certainly doing things, athletic accomplishments. I read a lot about people who, climb mountains or run races or do these extraordinary things. The catch is that I don't know if that is accessible for most of us. Most of us are not going to climb Mount Everest. We're not going to be president of the United States. We're not going to run ultra marathons. So you have to wonder, how do you make an ordinary life extraordinary? And to me, and there was an experience about 10 years ago that kind of framed all of this, but it's looking at your life and the things that happen to you in a different way. It's having a different perspective about what happens to you. Again, that's a choice that we all make with the information and the experiences that occur to us. So I think it requires a little bit of a shift in your mindset, a little bit of a change in perspective. If you can view the ordinary events of your life in a different way and recognize that they're an extraordinary miracle when it comes down to it. I'm a huge physics nerd and physics geek, and I spent a lot of my life investigating the world at its most fundamental levels and what's way out there in the universe. But if you the awesome complexity of the world we live in, it's just an astonishing miracle. And yet we have these ordinary things called love and freedom and hope, and they seem so meaningful to us. Well, there's a reason for that, right? And you can find those things in ordinary experiences. And when you do, I think your view of the world changes quite a bit.
Your book is full of these insights and stories. And clearly, I think you had to take the time to make space and to think about these like small observations and draw insights from them. Like we're all so busy in our day to day. We have texts, we have emails, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. Any tips on how we can make that space and time to start seeing the world differently?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Andy. I wrote a lot about this. We're absolutely bombarded with information on a daily basis, right? And a lot of it is negative, actually. So not only are we distracted by this enormous amount of information that we have in this day and age, but a lot of it is not really either well-intended or, inspires in us a positive view of the world. So what I kind of started doing was, you have to take a step back. You have to commit to writing some things down, maybe. Journaling was a huge, huge help for me because I'd see something beautiful or have a nice experience while they're quite ordinary. Uh, they're fleeting. They're easy to forget. And if you don't write them down or you don't, keep a little bit of a tally or an inventory of these things, then they're lost. I mean, they're not lost forever, but they're lost for a period of time, and their effect can go with it. So, for me, it was just about writing a bunch of things down, keeping a journal, a daily journal, and they eventually led to these stories into this book many years later, right?
That makes sense. The journaling really gives you, and it gives you a practice to reflect and to catalog. Did you know that this would become a book? Like when you started journaling, what was your original intention?
It's funny. I didn't think it'd become a book, but I did say to my English professor in college many, many years ago that I was going to write a book one day. And, he asked me, well, what was this book going to be about? And I said, it was some jumbling, dumb answer at the time because I really didn't know. I knew the inspiration was there, but, really what it was going to be about was somewhat unknown. But I started writing these things down, and I named this journal, and it was called The Other Things to Remember, because they were not major life events like my first job or your marriage, the birth of your kids, the death of a loved one. These things that are very hard to forget. These are the other things that I wanted to remember, the little things, and they became these stories. They became these memories. I had an opportunity in various settings to speak about these experiences in front of large groups. And the number one response that I got was that, have you ever considered publishing these stories? And maybe loosely in the back of my mind, I had considered it, but I didn't know anything about that world. When I finished my manuscript, I had a chance encounter with my high school English teacher, not my high school English teacher, but one that was at my high school. And he edited the first copy of that manuscript, and he got to the end of it. He said, you have an extraordinary story here, but you have to give this a shot through the commercial process. And I said, well, what does that mean? Like, I had no clue of how to do that, or any clue of how difficult that actually is. So, I was just this guy that had some nice stories and some nice experiences that he had written down, but, very little in the way of how to take it to the next step.
What did that process look like?
Uh, so I got to the end of the writing my manuscript, and, my advice to anybody on a writing journey would be to, just have faith in your idea, in your energy, because I was on version like 85 of my manuscript when I finished. And I went back and looked at the first couple of versions, and they were nothing like it was at the end. So I got to the end. I had him, do a copy edit, which is just sort of, crossing your T's, dotting your I's, basic punctuation, not anything about content really. And he says, look, you gotta give this a shot in the commercial process. You can always self-publish, but there's still a certain stigma to that. And he says, but I'm going to warn you, this is a tough process, and it will likely not be successful at the end. I mean, just based on probability and statistics of people that, try to publish books. And he said, the first thing is to get an agent. No publisher is going to accept a manuscript that is unagented, right? And I said, well, how do you do that? And he says, well, you got to go out to the internet and find one. You got to go out to the world and find one. You have to pitch yourself to, 100 different agencies. I mean, just that alone. And because knowing I'm an unknown, I'm sort of an anonymous, person. I'm not famous. I don't have a platform. And I knew that alone was going to be a very difficult process. I probably went through 100 different pitches to agents before I landed on the one that finally gave me a shot. And that was through a one-on-one interview that, just like we're having right now. And, pitching agents is like throwing a resume into a resume database. Like it just goes in there and nobody ever sees it and you'll never hear from anybody again. So again, it's a very unknown, very, I wouldn't say that it was frustrating to me because I had this sense that things were going to be okay, but you got to go through the process and you got to, it's a waiting game. You submit these things, you maybe hear back in 3 weeks, you don't hear at all. So I signed with the agent. Long story short, she took me through 3 rounds of submissions with all the best editors and publishers in the world. And the universal response was, this is great writing, but you're a nobody. You don't have a platform. So, I'm sorry. And, just like in business or just like in life, it came down to a personal relationship of mine, who introduced me to the CEO of quite a reputable publisher. And after an hour and a half conversation with him, he said, I'd like to give you a shot and publish your book. So there's a chapter in my book, sort of about my early part of my career, and it reinforces my testimony that relationships probably matter more than anything in business and in life. So, I went through a very rigorous process and experienced a lot of failure, only for it to come down to a personal relationship at the end of the day.
So don't shy away from the personal relationships.
No, and that's something I did not learn very early. I'm an introvert. I'm not particularly outgoing. I enjoy people, but going to a conference or a happy hour with a room full of people is not exactly something I enjoy.
Well, getting back to Memoirs of an Ordinary Guy, I just wanted to read this. You wrote, if you have the patience and humility to look when most others look away, and if you can pay attention to what's quietly dancing in the shadows, then you'll begin to rewrite your story, and it will change your life. And I love that passage because it is finding the gems in what would otherwise be ordinary. Can you take us back to, because you had darker days in your life when you were binge drinking and you really did, like, I would imagine, hit rock bottom and feel that need to rewrite your story. Like, can you tell us about that period in your life?
Sure. In looking back to my college days and shortly after, I didn't necessarily on the outside drink too differently than a lot of people. A lot of people at that stage in their lives, they kind of overdo it. They drink to get drunk. There was not a whole lot of gentlemanly drinking in college or shortly thereafter. But internally, I knew that I drank differently. I was not a daily drinker, Andy. I didn't crave it. It was not something that was like routine. But when I started, there was not really an off switch. And, this leads to like a kind of a cycle of, drinking all weekend, partying way too much, not really feeling better until about Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week, and then just starting it all over again. And then I really got in the bad habit of, after a night of, heavy drinking, having another beer or something early on the next day, sort of the hair of the dog syndrome, right? And that was not a good thing for me. It made you feel a lot better, and that's, probably why I did it. I liked feeling better. But that led to a couple sprees in my life that were not so great. Landed me in the emergency room 3 times and into a drug and alcohol rehab facility for a couple of days. And after you go through something like that, it's time to give it up. But I'll tell you about one experience that sort of opened my eyes. And I'm a big golfer. I love playing the game. And I went to a local driving range in the middle of the summer. And it was terribly hot out. I was very hungover. I was hitting balls. And I got this odd sense of disorientation. Like the feeling you have when you get lost in a place that you don't know where you are or you've never been. Except I got that feeling in a place that I had been hundreds of times. And I use this analogy in the book. If you remember the scene from the original Star Wars movie where Luke is looking across the desert at those two setting suns on Tatooine, right? And it's just after he's talking to his aunt and uncle about becoming a fighter pilot. And they say, well, no, you're not ready. Why don't you stay on the farm for another season? And he's a little frustrated. He doesn't know where, his life is taking him necessarily. And it's that quintessential moment for him where he takes, the next step in his life. And he sort of hangs his head, right? And I did the same thing on the mat there on that hot summer day. I hung my head and I looked up, across the horizon again. And I knew that I wasn't the man I wanted to be. And I knew that my life was not headed in the right direction. After that occurred, I had this odd sense that I had to leave. And I gave the bucket of balls that I had half empty, which would have never happened otherwise, handed them to the gentleman next to me, and I left. And that led to a chance encounter with an old friend. And in fact, led me to a very downward spiral in my life, but it put me on a trajectory of where I needed to go. I did face the bottom after that day on the mat, but it was the direction my life needed to go. And I don't know if you call that a miracle. That passage that you quoted, that chapter really is about everyday miracles. And I start that chapter with a wonderful scene from the movie Bruce Almighty, where Morgan Freeman, who plays the God character, and Jim Carrey are kind of arguing, and they're talking about miracles and, why does this person have a miracle? Why does this person not? What is it really? And Morgan Freeman answers them with, a single mom who's working two jobs and still finds the time to take her kid to soccer practice. That's a miracle. The teenager that says no to drugs and yes to an education, that's a miracle. And it's the last line that is so, meaningful to me. He says, people want me to do everything for them, but what they don't realize is that they have the power. And his last line is, you want to see a miracle, son? Be the miracle. And I say that, and my book is full of these things called everyday miracles, because I think they're mostly of our own making. It's the way that we view the world. It's how we interact with people in it, right? So I love that you picked up on that passage, because that's the essence of the book. If you have the patience and humility to look when most others look the other way, I think that's the key.
Well, that Morgan Freeman quote, and then throughout the book, it becomes very clear that movies and faith are like so important in your life.
Yeah. I heard, Martin Scorsese one time was quoted as saying, movies are, they bring out our greatest fantasies and joys and sorrows. Like they are, sort of our lives. They're, that I just feel that that's so true. They're such sources of inspiration. I say the same thing about books and reading. That's been a big part of my life. I like to say that, you have to explore the world to be comfortable in it. And there's no better way to do that through books and through what's been written, across history. Faith is a very important element of my life, but I know that, and have grown to know that is something that everybody has to find individually. I think there really is kind of no one size fits all. And, really at the end of the day, I think that the key is, and regardless of what tradition that you come up through or you embrace, you have to believe that you live in a purposeful place, that, in the awesome complexity of the universe, like I said, it created this, miracle of human life. It created these simple things called love that are so meaningful to us. And I doubt very much that that intelligence, whatever it may be, whether it's nature or God, missed this idea of purpose. It didn't just create us and spend all this time and energy to create something to live to die. So in my experience, faith in belief in something higher than yourself is the most logical thing that one can experience. And the fact that, my mother just passed away several weeks ago, and people ask me how you deal with that. And I said, well, death to me has always been illogical. Take religious context out of that for a second. It doesn't even really make sense. It never has, not even as a small child. So, again, when you get comfortable with these things, your view of the world changes. Your view of your own life changes a bit. And I think that that's an important endeavor for all of us.
My condolences on your mom's passing.
Thank you.
It's got to be a lot to go through. I wanted to ask you, because you talked about we don't need like more famous people in the world, or maybe like this idea of being extraordinary. It's unattainable for many of us. I wanted to ask you, why do you say that greatness to you is a reflex?
Well, it shouldn't be something that we think too much about. In that chapter that you read, there's a story about a young man with Down syndrome that I'd see at the bus stop every morning on my way to work. He worked at he had a Pizza Hut jacket on. He worked at a location right around the corner, actually not too far, probably, almost close enough to walk to, or for somebody to give him a ride. But there was that day that I saw him on a freezing cold day in January, rainy day in January. And I almost stopped, but I didn't. It wasn't a reflex. And it's not a reflex because I thought too much about it. It maybe was a relationship or an interaction I wasn't comfortable with. I'm not proud to admit that. But, we're all capable of being great. And that's a result of service, acknowledging other people's presence and experience. Like you said, we get very caught up in the things that we have to do individually in life. And maybe we lose a little bit of perspective for how others are living as well. Many years after I saw that young man at the bus stop, I saw a gentleman in an absolute downpour running to a bus stop outside of my gym. And again, I kept driving. I could have easily stopped and handed him the umbrella that was in the glove box. And I got about 30 seconds down the road, and I let this feeling of like compounding guilt send me back to the rescue. And I turned my car around and went back. And as I did that, I watched somebody else jump out of their car, hand the guy an umbrella, and drive off. And I said, well, that could have been me. He was soaking wet at that point. If I had done the same thing, a minute earlier, I would have made it, maybe a subtle difference in that guy's life. Maybe that act of charity and grace would have changed that guy's day. Could have changed his year. He could have gone home and hugged his wife differently that night, or repaid that favor somewhere else. But it wasn't a reflex. I let my individual shame and my commitment that I made when I saw that young man with Down syndrome at the bus stop to never let that happen again. Well, I did. It just wasn't a reflex. And it caused me to think of how many opportunities like that have I missed to serve somebody.
How often do you think about, or how often do you reflect on those missed opportunities?
I reflected on them quite a bit in the writing of my book. And some of the stories are where I did not live up to the standard for myself. And there were other times that I did. And the contrast between the two is immense in what it meant me in my life, maybe to the person that was with me in those stories. But I think the key is not to necessarily lament on them, to be aware of them, not to beat yourself up about them, but to be aware that in every minute there's an opportunity to serve in your interactions with people.
How do you view your purpose and the purpose of this book? Because as I read it, part of my takeaway is that this is really a study in how to be a better person, how to be a better human being. And you're kind of documenting your own personal journey in trying to achieve that.
I had to establish this up front. What was the purpose of this book? How was it going to reach people? What was it going to make an impact? And I sent out a sample to many, many people a number of years ago, about 50 people. And I said, I'm trying to write a book about the subtlety of life, and for people to not only acknowledge that, but to in their own lives remember their own little stories, their own little journals. And the number one response I got from sending that sample out to a lot of different people, now this was all family and friends, but they all said, you know what, I've had the same experience. I wish I had written some things down. It was very familiar to everybody. It was something that everybody could relate to and could apply to their own lives. And that's when I knew that maybe I had something of value, that I could create this gift and give back. Honestly, give back to a world that has given me so much. I hope that answers your question, but it was that initial response where I knew I had, struck a nerve with people, and a good one.
I'm sure that it can definitely inspire others, because they see from your example, and then also it just gets the wheels turning in your head. And I love the idea of greatness as a reflex, because we want to be able to do it without thinking. When you see somebody in need and you're driving your car through the rain, that you're not thinking about it, you're not hesitating. I think that that's something that we can all practice and improve. One of the other things that you talked about in your book, I noticed that you like Dale Carnegie's principle of don't criticize, condemn, or complain. I think I have issues with this. I think that I complain way too much. So give us some insight into what your experience has been like, and how do you do better, and maybe replace that with other traits that are more productive.
Yeah. And, I'll tell you a story that's actually not in that chapter. It's in another chapter, but I think it changed my mindset in a lot of ways. I was working for a big defense contractor, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now. And I had an office that overlooked a parking lot, and in particular, a row of handicapped spaces. And there was this young woman who was in a wheelchair who was in our accounting department. And as I looked out the window that day, I saw her pulling in. And it was one of those moments where, time seems to slow down a bit and things get really clear and focused. So I decided to pay attention to that feeling, and I watched her for a couple of minutes as she got out of her car. And, that car had been engineered where she can, use the brakes and the steering wheel and the accelerator with her hands. And I watched the process that she went through just to get out of her car. I watched, as I wrote about gravity, play this cruel tug of war with, her lifeless lower body. She was paralyzed from the waist down. I was close enough where I could see the look on her face, and that it was an unwanted struggle. It was years of frustration that came out in that couple minutes that I watched her. And I immediately thought about the countless other things in her life that are just so much more difficult than mine. And the first thought that came to mind is that I committed myself to, well, you'll never hear me say that I had a hard day. And that chapter that is written in is called The Four Horsemen. And it's about like four of my personal heroes. And they all happen to be in a wheelchair. And I to complain and to, is just is dishonoring their struggle in a way. It's just not something that I do. I just don't want to do it. That I have held myself to a higher standard in. I just think it's a lack of perspective for those who have a lot of struggles in life, and I just won't do it.
Thanks for the perspective. I will now reframe that when I'm driving down the street and somebody turns without signaling.
Yeah, right. But at the end of the day, it's a waste of energy. And, when somebody cuts you off, like, there's that wonderful quote by Viktor Frankl, who was an Austrian psychologist and Holocaust survivor. And he says, in between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. There's a choice in how you view that. And it's in that space that basically determines our growth in life. And I never forgot that quote. I mean, for a guy that lived through the Holocaust and the seemingly years of torment that probably created afterwards, for him to have that perspective, that's what I mean when I say an extraordinary perspective about what happens to us.
No, that helps a lot. I think that most of our first world problems are very trivial.
Yeah. And going back to like when somebody cuts you off, you can let that ruin the next 10 minutes of your life or the rest of the day or not. Again, that's a choice that we make with what happens to us.
I will try to practice my just smile and wave.
Right.
So I want to look at purpose maybe from a different angle, because you did write about when you were back in college, you didn't have a passion for what you were studying. Did you know what you wanted to be?
I did. And, this is what I lived a very important lesson that I can then hopefully teach others, including my children. I wanted to be a physicist, Andy. I liked math. I liked English and I liked writing. I chose to study biology, which was something I was not good at. I was not good at just reading a textbook and memorizing everything in it. In fact, that was something I struggled with for many years. I was very good at the logic of math, the logic of writing, getting my emotions and my heart and my soul out on paper. That was something I was very good at. But I chose biology because I thought it sounded smart. I went to an out to work day with my neighbor who worked for the National Cancer Institute at NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. I told people I wanted to tackle big problems like cancer and AIDS. That was all a lie. I just did it because I thought it sounded smart. I had an insecurity about that as a young person. I was very tongue-tied. I didn't think I was, all that bright. I had this daydreaming, wandering mind, and I always thought there was something wrong with me. So, and added to that, I had some very big opportunities handed my way. My uncle was the chief operating officer of Coopers & Lybrand, which was the predecessor company to PricewaterhouseCoopers. He got my first internship for me. And as much as he did me an enormous favor to get my career started the right way, it was what I wrote about in my book. I called it a white collar death sentence, because in taking the easy road there, I bypassed and surrendered everything I ever wanted to do. It was the easy way out. I didn't have to have a good GPA to get a job at a Big Five consulting firm. I already had that. There was no scrutiny on my grades in college, and I was just able to coast through. I went back to Virginia Tech many years later, and I had this sense of guilt that I didn't give it my best shot, that I didn't do what I wanted to do. I remember pulling up to a stop sign on my first day of work, and I had this deep anxiety. I'm like, this is not what I want to do with my life. But I only did that because it was the shortcut to the top. And I'll tell anybody that, the harder path is the right one.
So if you could do it all over again, would you have done differently? And I guess the follow-up to that is, how do you reconcile that today?
I would have, in high school, I said I wanted to go to Caltech. I wanted to study the stars. I wanted to investigate the world at the most fundamental level. I have a intense curiosity for quantum theory. At this point in my life, I've read dozens and dozens of books on the subject. So what I didn't get in an education, I developed into a hobby. And I think while I'll never be an expert in that field or never accomplish something in that field, you go back to faith. My passion for physics has, crossed ways with my faith in a very good way. It's reinforced everything that I ever believed about the world. And maybe I wouldn't have gotten that if it had been a profession as opposed to a hobby later in life. So would I go back and do anything differently? No, but I should have told myself, stay on the harder path. So I tell that to myself now, right?
I like that you can still hold on to it and still have it as a passion, even though it didn't become your career.
Yeah. We have the opportunity to do that. Like I said, reading is a very important part of my life because, you get to choose the adventures that you take and the things that you learn, and they cost almost nothing.
Danny, this idea of adventure, can you share with us, how did Jamie Clarke impact your life?
And going back to that idea that I wanted to be a physicist, I wanted to be a mountaineer. At the end of that internship with PricewaterhouseCoopers after my junior year in college, they took us down to the Disney Institute, which was a week-long kind of team building environment where interns from the Big Five across the country came. And Jamie was the concluding motivational speaker at that conference. And from start to finish, there was an absolute blazing fire in my heart. And I sat there on the edge of that chair in that auditorium, my feet bouncing off the floor and my head almost tingling, because he represented everything of what I wanted to be. And I knew it was gone. I knew I, at that point, had not put myself on a trajectory to be him. I would have followed him out that front door and done whatever he asked me to do. I wanted to live a life of adventure, and sitting in a cubicle and staring at spreadsheets for the next 20 years was not exactly, while that put me on a good path in my life financially and professionally, it's not what appealed to my soul. And coincidentally, 20 years later, I'm working for a trade association in Washington, representing aerospace and defense companies. And I put on these 3 big conferences a year. And I thought of Jamie. And as he would say, as fate would have it, I played softball with the vice president of Kepler Speakers, which was his booking agent. And I was able to kind of skip a few places in line and get him booked for a conference. And, we reunited after 20 years, and I got a chance to talk to him for a while before he got up on stage. And I told him what he meant to me. I told him that he was my hero. I told him he was he represented a lot of the things I wanted to do in life. And he taught me some very important lessons. One being that I had not worked hard enough to get where I got, that I got lucky. There was one photograph in particular where he was training for his first or second Everest attempt. And he had a 90-pound backpack on. And he was on a treadmill at max incline for 2 hours. And instantly I knew I was not willing to work that hard. And I hadn't. I got lucky. But mostly I was not willing to. And that's what I knew. So, he just became, this central figure in my life, even though I didn't really know him, but we reunited 20 years later, and and we sort of developed a friendship. And I thought, how cool would it be if you wrote the foreword to my book? And it's just too crazy to think about, right?
It goes back to the importance of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did that play into you actually, this idea of not taking the hard road? How does that play into leaving a good, stable job to go to a pre-revenue startup?
Yeah. In that chapter is entitled The Canadian. And at that conference 20 years ago, I met him very briefly, just for him to sign a postcard and shake my hand. And he, on the postcard, it was written, "Hey, Dan, climb on, Jamie." And after that conference, after he spoke, he descended the stage. This is 20 years later. He descended the stage and he gave me the biggest bear hug of my life. And instantly I remembered what was written on that postcard. And I was like, I know what I need to do. I need to take a major risk here in my life. And it's kind of funny, but if I had not made that decision at that exact moment, the startup would not be where it is today, or certainly not in the same position. I ended up leaving that startup because the gentleman that I wrote about in that chapter, who I met on my first day as an intern with Coopers and Lybrand, called me up one day and said his chief operating officer was retiring. Actually, I take that back. I sent him a copy of the story, and he said, "Wow, that was awesome. Oh, by the way." And I was very comfortable where I was. And I was not, necessarily the candidate on paper for that job, the chief operating officer of a $50 million company. But I said, you know what? Whereas before I would have just stayed the easy path, I'm gonna make the harder choice here. And that ended up being the right one. The startup continued to do what it needed to do. And I took this right turn in my career that has been a wonderful choice.
This idea of financial stability versus doing something that feeds your soul. I want to know, how do you view money?
People, this is probably cliched to say, but I think if you work hard, you develop the right relationships, you continue to do the right thing, the money will come. I've never tried to force the money. There's been plenty of years in my life that I didn't make a ton of it. I made enough, but I was not obsessed with it. I didn't rush things. I think, going back to the faith element, I think when you have faith in yourself and belief in a greater purpose, you stop trying to force things in life. You become a little bit more patient with life. And these things will come. They'll be okay. I say that fully understanding that maybe that's not the case for a lot of people. I write a lot about, there's a lot of disparity in the world. So money is not what drives my happiness. It's a function of my behavior. I'd be perfectly happy with less of it. And I think that's another point of why I wrote the book. If you can't, find incredible joy and beauty in just the ordinary things in life, then I think we've all missed the bigger picture.
Danny, I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
I define success by how much peace you've found in your own life, how much satisfaction you've found with your own experience, how you've come to terms with what's happened to you, how you've loved others. Nobody's going to look at somebody who didn't make a whole lot of money, but it was a wonderful person, treated others with love and respect and compassion, that they didn't have a successful life. I wouldn't say that we would look at somebody who worked on the factory line their whole lives and say just because they didn't make manager or president of that company that they weren't successful in a way or another. So success is defined as how well you lived, how you impacted other people, how you served other people, how you loved other people, and how you loved yourself at the end of the day too. Maybe that being the most important thing. If you don't love yourself first, then how can you possibly love other people?
Great lessons. Well, thank you for sharing your seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary and trying to be great and developing that muscle so that it's more of a reflex than anything else. Tell the Inspired Money listeners and viewers where they can get your book and where they can follow you.
Sure, no problem. I've created a website where it has basically all the content from the book, from various interviews like this, links to Amazon where you can buy the book. There's reviews and advanced praise and things like that. In news, it's www.dannyolmes.com, OLMES. And that's where you can find everything.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Congrats on the book.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate you having me on. This is a wonderful opportunity and love chatting with you.
So what was your favorite Inspired Money moment? I love Danny's definition of greatness, in that greatness should be a reflex. My favorite Inspired Money moment was to complain less and instead find joy and beauty in ordinary things. Try practicing that every day and see what impact it has on your happiness and outlook. If you had a different favorite Inspired Money moment, please post a comment or find me on LinkedIn. Before you go, subscribe to my email at inspiredmoney.fm/newsletter. Every 2 weeks, my brother and I write an email that highlights data, news, and events that we think are worth sharing. Thanks for joining me on this mission. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.